A woman was found dead in the bathtub of her own home, and it looked like the saddest kind of accident. She had slipped, struck her head, and drowned. A coroner's jury agreed. The case was closed, and a widower was left to grieve. There was just one detail about that drowning that nobody wanted to dwell on. The bathtub was dry. For 3 years, it stayed a closed case until the same man's next wife vanished, and somebody finally went back and looked again. Her name was Kathleen Savio. The widower was her ex-husband, Drew Peterson, a police sergeant in the Chicago suburb of Bolingbrook, and her third husband, though by the spring of 2004, the marriage was all but over. They were in the final bitter stretch of a divorce, with the settlement about to be signed, the kind of split where one person stands to lose a great deal of money, a house, a pension, a measure of control. And there is something you need to know before the rest of it, because it changes how you hear everything that follows. In the months and years before she died, Kathleen Savio had told people, friends, relatives, the police, that she was afraid of her husband. She had called officers to the house. She said more than once in words others would later repeat under oath that she believed he would kill her and that he would find a way to make it look like an accident. She even put it in writing. The divorce threatened to cost him dearly, a share of the house, the pension, the assets of 2 decades, and she warned that he would rather see her dead than split it. She was, it turned out, describing her own death before it happened. Prosecutors would later present something even colder than a premonition. A witness testified that before Savio died, Peterson had tried to hire someone to have her killed, that the murder had been shopped around before it was ever done quietly at home. The accident in the light looks like a fallback, when no hired hand would do it. It was simply made to look like the tub had. On the 1st of March, 2004, with the divorce nearly final, Kathleen Savio was found dead in the bathtub of her home, discovered after she stopped answering, when neighbors went to check and a locksmith let them in. The story that assembled around her was simple and gentle. She had been taking a bath, slipped, struck her head, lost consciousness, and drowned. A terrible household accident. A coroner's jury looked at it and agreed accidental drowning. It is worth noting who helped that conclusion along. The inquest included a colleague of Peterson's from the same police world, and Peterson's young girlfriend, at the time a woman named Stacy, told investigators he had been with her, giving him an alibi. The paperwork was signed. Kathleen Savio's death became officially a slip in the tub, and for 3 years that is exactly what it stayed, and it mattered enormously that the man at the center of it wore a badge. Drew Peterson had spent decades as a police officer. He knew how a death scene gets read, what investigators look for, and what they wave past, which questions get asked, and which get skipped. He moved through the system that was supposed to examine him as a colleague, not a suspect. A staged accident is hard enough to see through when a stranger builds it. It is far harder when the builder is one of the people you would otherwise trust to investigate it. But go back and stand in that bathroom and read the scene the way the evidence would eventually force everyone to read it. Start with the tub itself. It was dry. A woman had supposedly drowned in it, and drowning requires water, a great deal of it. Yet the tub was empty and clean, with no water pooled around her body. Her hair was wet. The place she had supposedly drowned was not. Then look at her. She had a deep gash on the back of her head more than an inch long, the kind of wound a hard blow leaves. And she was not bruised in a single spot the way one fall would leave a person. She was covered in fresh bruises and scrapes, as though she had fought against someone. A simple slip leaves one injury. This was many. A drowning leaves water. This had none. The scene was a sentence that did not parse, and for 3 years no one with the power to act would read it out loud. That is the quietly horrifying part of a staged accident. It does not have to be clever to work. It only has to meet a world that would rather not look. No one wanted to believe a mother of 2 had been murdered in her own bathroom. There was no pressure to dig. There was a convenient alibi, and there was an inquest stocked with familiar faces. The lie was thin. It survived anyway, because nobody pushed on it. We tend to believe accidents, partly because the alternative that someone close chose this is so much harder to hold. The stager is counting on exactly that reluctance. It is the first thing he builds with. What finally pushed was not new science. It was a second tragedy. In October of 2007, Drew Peterson's 4th wife, that same Stacy, by then married to him, vanished without a trace. She has never been found, and Peterson became the prime suspect in her disappearance. And suddenly a pattern that had been invisible snapped into focus. 2 wives, 1 dead in a dry bathtub, 1 simply gone. Kathleen's own family had never made peace with the accident. They had doubted it from the start, and they had pushed for another look, another examination, anyone willing to reconsider. For 3 years, that push had gone nowhere. Now, with a 2nd wife missing and the cameras arriving, it finally found an audience. Under that new light, Kathleen Savio's body was exhumed and examined again, this time by 2 separate forensic pathologists, one retained by her family and one by the state, neither of whom had any part in the original gentle conclusion. They arrived at the same answer independently. The gash on her head looked like the result of a blow, not a slip. The bruises looked like a struggle, and a healthy woman does not lose her footing, drown, and leave a tub bone dry. She had drowned after a violent fight, they concluded, and her body had been placed in the tub afterward. Her death was reclassified from accident to homicide. In the investigators' own words, it had been a killing staged to look like an accident. And then something rare happened. The dead woman got to speak. To convict Peterson, prosecutors needed the jury to hear what Kathleen Savio and the missing Stacy had said while they were alive. Their fear, their warnings, in their own words. Illinois actually changed its law to allow it, opening a path for the statements of victims who could no longer testify, because the accused had silenced them. So at his trial, the 2 women he was accused of removing from the world testified anyway from beyond it, Kathleen, describing years in advance the exact way she expected to die. It was an extraordinary thing to witness in a courtroom. A murder case carried in large part by the voices of the victims themselves, preserved, in the fears they had confided while they were still alive. The very thing the staging had been built to silence turned out to be the thing that convicted him. So look at what the staging really was. Not a brilliant criminal scheme, a bet. Drew Peterson bet that no one would look hard at a dead ex-wife in a bathtub, that the world's own reluctance to see a murder would do the hiding for him. For 3 years, he won that bet. What finally beat it was not a clever detective or a forensic miracle. It was a second disappearance that made people at last willing to see what had been sitting in plain view the whole time. The staging had been a confession all along, written in a dry tub and a wounded scalp. It just needed someone willing to read it. In 2012, Drew Peterson was convicted of murdering Kathleen Savio and sentenced to decades in prison. Later, almost unbelievably, he was convicted a second time for plotting from his cell to have the prosecutor who put him there killed. Stacy Peterson has still never been found. Through all of it, Drew Peterson behaved like a man enjoying a show. While the public wondered aloud whether he had killed two wives, he courted the reporters camped outside his house, cracked jokes, mugged for the cameras at one point, even playing along with a radio station stunt to find him a new date. It was its own kind of staging, a man insisting with a grin that there was nothing here worth looking at. And Kathleen Savio, who had told anyone who would listen that her husband would kill her and dress it up as an accident, turned out to have predicted not only her death, but the exact shape of the lie that would be told about it. She had named it in advance. It took the rest of the world 3 years and another missing woman to finally believe her. A quick thought from me, Johnson, before the next one, because the lie is about to change shape. Notice what Drew Peterson's staging actually asked of the world, that nothing had happened at all. A clumsy slip, a tragic accident, no crime to see, just look away. He bet on people not wanting to look, and for 3 years he collected. But the next man wanted more than your inattention. He wanted your agreement. He needed you to look straight at a dead woman in his foyer and conclude that she had put the gun in her own mouth. Case 2. Phil Spector and Lana Clarkson. Alhambra, California. 2003. Staged as a suicide. Just before dawn in the marble foyer of a mansion outside Los Angeles, a woman sat slumped in a chair, dead, a gun on the floor at her feet. The man who owned the house, one of the most famous music producers alive, had a simple explanation. She had shot herself. She was practically a stranger. They had met only that night, and she had chosen his foyer, he said, to end her life. His driver, waiting in the car outside, remembered the first moments a little differently. He remembered the man stepping out of the house with a gun still in his hand and saying something that did not sound at all like a man describing a suicide. Her name was Lana Clarkson, and she deserves to be more than the way she died. She was 40 years old, an actress. She had carried the lead in a cult fantasy film in the 80s and turned up in a movie nearly everyone has seen. And like a great many actresses who reach 40 in Hollywood, she had watched the roles dry up. To keep going, she had taken a job as a hostess at the House of Blues on the Sunset Strip. By the accounts of the people who actually knew her, she was warm and funny and far from giving up. She had been putting together a comedy reel, chasing the next chapter. Her family and friends would say again and again that she was not a woman on the edge of ending her life. She met Phil Spector late on the night of February 2nd, 2003, at the end of her shift, and left with him for his mansion in Alhambra. A few hours later, she was dead. And for the next 6 years, the man in whose home she died would spend a fortune insisting that the last thing Lana Clarkson ever did was put a gun in her own mouth. And that is the cruelty running underneath the whole case. To sell the suicide, The defense had to turn Lana Clarkson into the kind of woman who would do it to paint her as washed up, broke, and despairing a has-been out of hope. Her mother and her friends spent years pushing back against that portrait, insisting it was a lie, that the woman they knew bore no resemblance to the one the lawyers described. A staged suicide does not just steal a person's life. It puts their character on trial to explain their death. It helps to understand who Spector was because it bears directly on what happened. He was a genuine musical genius, the architect of the wall of sound, a producer who had shaped some of the most famous records of the century. He was also, by long and well-documented reputation, a man who collected guns and pulled them out when he did not get his way. Musicians who had worked with him traded the stories like folklore sessions, where he locked the doors, where a pistol appeared to settle an argument or to keep someone from leaving. For years, it had all been treated as the colorful menace of a difficult genius. It would stop being a harmless story the night Lana Clarkson died. Spector's account of the death was clean and self-contained. Clarkson had found his antique pistol, he said, put it to her own mouth, and pulled the trigger, a stranger's suicide in his house, having nothing to do with him. And on the surface, the scene could be made to fit. The gun lay near her. There was gunshot residue on her hands. The wound was inside her mouth, where self-inflicted gunshot wounds often are. If you wanted to believe it, the evidence left you room. But there were two facts the tidy story could never quite swallow. The first was Spector's own driver. Adriano de Souza had brought Clarkson and Spector back to the mansion and was waiting outside in the car. He told police that Spector came out the back door with a gun in his hand and said, "I think I killed somebody." Not, "She shot herself." Not, "Something terrible has happened." "I think I killed somebody." De Souza was alarmed enough to call 911. And when the Alhambra police arrived, Spector did not behave like a grieving witness to a stranger's suicide. He resisted them, and officers had to subdue him with a stun gun. His first words to his driver were never explained away. The second fact was on Spector's own body. He had worn a white dinner jacket that night, and when it was examined, it carried 18 separate spots of Lana Clarkson's blood. The fine spatter thrown off in the instant. A bullet strikes flesh. Blood like that does not drift lazily across a room. To catch that spray on his sleeve, Spector had to be standing not elsewhere in the house, not across the foyer, but directly in front of her, within a couple of feet of her mouth, at the moment the gun went off. Now, I want to be honest, because this was a genuinely fought case, not a slam dunk. Spector's lawyers hired serious forensic experts, and they made real arguments that the gunshot residue and blood on Clarkson's own hands fit a self-inflicted wound. That blood spatter can, under some conditions, travel several feet, that Spector's fingerprints were not even on the gun. The case grew so tangled that one of the most famous forensic scientists in the world, working for the defense, was later accused of quietly removing something from the scene. His first trial in 2007 ended with the jury deadlocked, most leaning toward guilt, a stubborn minority unconvinced, and a mistrial was declared. Reasonable people looked at the same evidence and split down the middle. The science by itself did not settle it. What tipped it in the end was not a single piece of forensics. It was a pattern. At the retrial, one after another, women took the stand, and described the same thing happening to them, that when they had tried to leave Phil Spector to walk out of a room out of his house, he had pulled a gun on them to make them stay. 5 different women. The same story. Across the years. A man who put a gun to a woman's head when she tried to leave was not some neutral bystander to Lana Clarkson's death in his foyer. He was by far its most likely cause. And once you see that the suicide resolves into exactly what the prosecutors had said all along, a stage scene, the gun wiped down, a blood-soaked cloth left in a bathroom as if someone had tried to clean up, a body left sitting in a chair, a powerful, articulate man with a tidy story and the money to sell it, betting that the death of a fading actress in his mansion would read to a tired world as one more sad Hollywood ending, a woman who had lost her shine and decided to end it. The staging here was barely physical at all. It was mostly a story and the confidence to keep telling it, and it was a story working against his own mouth. The scene said suicide. The man himself had already said out loud to his driver that he had killed somebody. The staging was an attempt to paint over a confession he had blurted out before he thought better of it, to make that quiet foyer tell a calmer story than the one he had told first. See how the lie has grown since the bathtub. Drew. Peterson's staging asked the world to believe that nothing had happened. An accident, no crime, look away. Phil Spector's asked for something colder. It asked the world to believe that the victim had done it to herself to take Lana Clarkson's death and rewrite it as her own decision, her own despair, and in the same stroke to clear the man standing over her body. A staged suicide is not only a disguise, it is an accusation aimed at the one person in the room who can no longer say a single word in her own defense. And his fame was part of the staging, whether he intended it or not. A famous man's tidy story gets a different hearing than a stranger's. The instinct to give Phil Spector the benefit of the doubt and to quietly write off the dead woman as one more sad Hollywood casualty was already doing some of his work for him. A stage scene always leans on what its audience is inclined to believe. This one leaned on status and on how cheaply the world can hold a fading actress's life. It took 2 trials, but in 2009, a jury convicted Phil Spector of murdering Lana Clarkson. He went to prison, and he died there in 2021, still insisting he was innocent. For 6 years, his defense had told the world that Lana Clarkson pulled the trigger on herself. The verdict took that last lie away from him and gave her back the one thing he had tried to bury, along with her, the simple truth that she did not choose to die in a stranger's foyer. Someone else chose it for her. Johnson here, one quick word before the last story, and it's the heaviest one in this video. So brace for it. If these are worth your time, subscribing and leaving a comment is what keeps the channel alive and tells me which cases to dig into next. Okay? The last one? Because Spector's lie, for all its cruelty, still pointed inward. He blamed the dead, the one person who could never answer back. And a lie aimed at the dead asks nothing of you but a shrug. The last story is what happens when the staging turns outward at the living. When a man hides his crime not behind an accident and not behind his victim, but behind a stranger, and picks that stranger to match exactly what a whole city was already afraid of. A young couple was driving home from a birthing class, their first baby due in a matter of weeks, when the call reached Boston police a man frantic, gasping that he and his pregnant wife had been shot by a stranger who had forced his way into their car. The wife was dying. The husband was badly wounded. The city believed him completely. It believed him so completely that it tore an entire neighborhood apart, looking for the man he described. The only trouble was that the man he described had never existed, and a great many innocent people would be hurt before anyone in charge was willing to say so. It was the night of October 23rd, 1989. Charles and Carol Stewart had just left a birthing class at a Boston hospital. Carol was a tax attorney, well-loved, 7 months pregnant with their first child, a boy they had already decided to name Christopher. As they drove home through the Mission Hill neighborhood, Charles called 911 from his car phone, his voice ragged and breaking. He and his wife had been shot. He said by a black man in a jogging suit with a raspy voice who had climbed into their car and robbed them. A dispatcher kept him talking, struggling to find them in the dark. The recording would be played across the country, and it broke people's hearts. The damage was real and terrible. Carol had been shot in the head, and she died that night. Their son was delivered weeks early by emergency surgery and lived only 17 days. Charles himself had been shot in the abdomen, a serious, genuine wound. To the police, the press, and the watching city here was a man who had somehow survived the same attack that killed his wife and unborn child. A victim, a grieving husband, the perfect, unquestionable witness to his own crime. Because that is what it was. Charles Stewart had shot Carol himself and then turned the gun on his own body to sell the story. The motive was the oldest and smallest kind he wanted out, and he wanted money. There was a substantial life insurance payout waiting on his wife's death. There was, by accounts that surfaced later, another woman and a future he wanted that did not include a wife and a baby. He dreamed of leaving his job to open a restaurant. He had reportedly tried, in the weeks before, to talk others into helping him kill her. When no one would, he did it himself and dressed it as a robbery gone wrong. And for months, none of that was visible. Charles Stewart was the most sympathetic man in Boston. The recording of his 911 call played on the news on a loop. The image of a husband shot beside his dying pregnant wife became the city's shared heartbreak. Carol's funeral drew crowds and dignitaries. He had not merely invented a villain, he had cast himself as the hero of the tragedy, and a whole city rose to comfort him. And the story he told landed in a city all but begging to believe it. Boston in 1989 was a place on edge about crime, its newspapers running breathless headlines, its old racial wounds never far below the surface. A white suburban couple, a pregnant wife, a black attacker in a poor black neighborhood. The tale did not have to be proven because it fit exactly what a great many people already feared and already believed. It confirmed a picture they were carrying around with them anyway, and a lie that confirms what you already think is the easiest lie in the world to tell. What followed was less an investigation than an occupation. Police flooded Mission Hill. Black men were stopped, frisked, thrown against walls, by some counts well over 100 times a day, an entire neighborhood treated as a single suspect. The city had been told its monster was a black man from Mission Hill, and it went looking exactly where the story pointed, with a fury it would never have aimed at its own suburbs. This was a city with deep and recent racial wounds, and the Stewart case tore them open. To many Black Bostonians, the crackdown on Mission Hill, the searches, the certainty, the manhunt aimed at a whole community, on one white man's word, confirmed everything they already understood about how the city saw them. For decades afterward, the case would be told as exactly that kind of parable, how easily an entire neighborhood could be condemned, because the accusation matched the picture the powerful were already holding, and it produced suspects because it was determined too. First, police arrested a Black homeless man named Alan Swanson, who happened to own a tracksuit resembling the one Stewart described. They jailed him for 3 weeks, his name in the papers as the suspect in a pregnant woman's murder. Then they released him and fixed on another man, Willie Bennett, who had a record and whose name surfaced in part because his own nephew had made an offhand joke about it. Officers descended on the Bennett family home. Relatives would describe police breaking through the door, children watching men with shields pour in. A case was assembled, and Charles Stewart brought into view a lineup pointed at Willie Bennett. It was a lineup by several accounts in which the other men were clean-cut police officers, and witnesses would later say they had been pressured into identifying Bennett at all. Stop and see where this was heading. An innocent man was a step or two from being convicted of murdering a pregnant woman, a crime that had not happened the way anyone was being told, committed by an attacker who did not exist. The staging had not merely hidden a killer. It had very nearly handed a different, innocent man over to take his place. And the man it chose was not by accident Black. So how did it finally come apart? Not through the investigation. The investigation was busy building a case against the wrong man. It came apart from the inside. Charles Stewart had not acted entirely alone. His own brother Matthew had helped him that night, met him, and taken away a bag holding the gun and the couple's wallets and jewelry. Matthew would always insist he believed he was helping his brother pull off an insurance scam and that he did not understand it was murder until he saw Carol's death reported on television the next day. For weeks he carried that knowledge in silence. But as he watched the police close in on Willie Bennett as an innocent man came within reach of prison for it, something in him broke. In early January 1990, Matthew went to the authorities and told them the truth. The man who shot Carol Stewart was her husband. It had taken a painful family reckoning to get there. The Stewart siblings sitting down with a lawyer so that Matthew could finally say aloud what he had been carrying for weeks. Once he did, the end came quickly. And here is the detail that should sit heaviest of all. Matthew was not the only one who knew. A later analysis by the Boston Globe found that something like 33 people had known or strongly suspected the truth before the police would admit it. The lie had never been airtight. It had simply been convenient and comfortable and confirming. The people with the power to stop it, the city would one day acknowledge, had seen the story they wanted to see, and kept staring at it long after it stopped making sense. Now, follow the whole arc of these 3 stories to its end. Drew Peterson staged a scene so the world would believe no crime had happened at all. Phil Spector staged one so the world would blame the victim. And Charles Stewart staged one so the world would blame a stranger, and he did not choose his stranger at random. He chose coldly and correctly the exact kind of man his city was already primed to convict on sight. That is the most dangerous staging, There is not the lie that hides a body, but the lie that points at someone else and gets believed not because it is convincing, but because it flatters what people already wanted to think. Because that is the thread running beneath all three of these cases. A stage scene is only ever as strong as its audience's willingness to accept it. We believe the accident because we would rather not imagine the murder. We believe the suicide because the man telling us is powerful and the dead woman is easy to dismiss. We believe the stranger because he looks like the villain we were already afraid of. The staging is always a confession, but it is a confession we will help to bury, so long as the story it tells is one we were already telling ourselves. Charles Stuart never stood trial. The morning after his brother went to the police with the truth closing in on him, he drove to the Tobin Bridge over the Mystic River and jumped to his death, leaving behind a note that admitted nothing. Carol and her baby were gone. Matthew Stewart was convicted of helping to cover it up and died years later of a drug overdose. Carol's own family reached for a grace the case otherwise lacked. They built a foundation in her name and chose to spend it on scholarships for young people from Mission Hill, the very neighborhood her husband's lie had branded a suspect. The family of the woman at the center of it all turned deliberately toward the community that had been wronged in her name. And Alan Swanson and Willie Bennett, two men who had done nothing at all, carried the weight of that invented crime for the rest of their lives. Bennett would say decades on that the mere sound of Charles Stewart's name still gave him chills. In 2023, the city of Boston formally apologized to both men and said plainly what it had spent 30 years not saying, that there had never been a shred of evidence a black man committed this crime, and that those in power had swallowed the lie precisely because it felt familiar. The man who built that lie was never made to answer for it in any courtroom, but the staging answered for him. And so in the end did the brother who could not stand to watch an innocent man pay for what he had done. 3 stage scenes, 3 different lies. A dry bathtub meant to say, accident. A gun placed to say, she did it herself. A stranger invented to say, it was one of them. Each was a story carefully built by the person who most needed you to look anywhere but at him. And every one of those stories was also a confession. Because to fake an accident, you have to know it wasn't one. To stage a suicide, you have to know it was murder. To invent a robber, you have to know there was never a robber. The staging is a killer telling you in code exactly what he is hiding and where to look if anyone is willing. But that is the catch, and it is the thread beneath all 3. A stage scene only works on a willing audience. Drew Peterson needed a world that did not want to picture a murdered mother in a bathtub. Phil Spector needed one that would take a famous man's word and quietly write off a fading actress. Charles Stewart needed a city already prepared to believe the worst of a black stranger. The lie succeeds exactly to the degree that it tells us something we already wanted to believe, which means the staging is never really finished by the killer. It is finished by us every time we accept the easy story, because looking harder would cost us something. So maybe that is the part worth keeping. When a death comes wrapped in a story that is a little too tidy, a little too convenient, a little too flattering to what we already think that tidiness is not always the absence of a crime. Sometimes it is the shape of one. I'm Johnson. Thank you for sitting with these. I'll see you on the next.